Greetings all, Raphael, Dr. Raphael X here with my friend Robert to discuss again. Here we are talking about the differences between East and West, and the topic will be theology. Right, we'll do a um, historical run, just seeing the main differences in the manner that theology is done, basically. But let us start with a prayer before anything else. Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Gloria Patri et Filio Spiritui Sancto, sicut erat in principio et nunc et semper et in saecula saeculorum. Amen. Ave Maria, sede sapientiae, ora pro nobis. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. All right, perfect. East and West. First of all, subscribe to the channel. Click on the like button, notification button, share this video, leave a comment, all that good stuff. All right, so today, theology, how it's done, because, well, increasingly, there's been a mutual, we can say, a disrespect, well, to say the least, a mutual despising of before the schism. Not so much now. I think now is the more the problems on the East, to be honest, because a lot of the more recent popes have kind of reached out to the Orthodox Church, and a lot of people have a lot of the churches. A lot of people in the churches have become Catholic, which is very interesting. Um, but again, the manner of theology is very interesting. I think the Orthodox, and this may be a more contemporary view, but the Orthodox see Western theology as intellectualist, as rationalist, which stems from scholasticism. Scholasticism, we can say, started with Saint Anselm, 11th century, and culminated in St. Thomas Aquinas. And then there was definitely a decadence in scholasticism for sure. But scholasticism, right, its main work was the emergence of, well, kind of assuming a sound philosophy to explicate, to expound the principles of theology, to expound our faith. So theology as faith plus philosophy, right? So we have the mysteries of the faith received through revelation, but what we try to do is explicate them using philosophy and theology as a science. And I think this is the problem that a lot of the Orthodox have, who tend to be more, right, tend to see theology as something more mystical, something more ineffable, which meaning we can't pronounce. Something also called negative theology. We can know more. We can not know about God, in the sense that we can say we can say what God is not, as opposed to what God is, called negative theology. And almost, the West may accuse them of being kind of irrationalist, right, in a sense. So we'll talk about these theologies, how it's done, but basically, the East, it seems so, and this is the opinion of some theologians, that the basis of the separation was of the East from the West was really the East kind of despising the Latin fathers. Again, it was mutual, but it was more patent, we can say, more manifest in the East. So I don't know if you want to comment a little bit here, Robert, or you want to chime in here.
I think one of the the big things to note is that the mutual uh, the mutual dislike and the mutual excommunication, sort of, because you did have, when Saint Benedict wrote his monastic rule, that he was afraid to mention Saint Basil the Great by name, even though he borrowed from him heavily, because he was afraid he wouldn't get his monastic rule approved. So I believe he would just outright quote Basil the Great, and then instead of saying like dash Basil the Great, it would say like dash the great monastic father, things like that. So there is sort of a mutualism with that. And I did hear you mention the negative theology, which I always found negative theology to be very interesting, because I one of the main Eastern fathers that I remember, and I don't remember the name, it may be one of the Gregories, because there's a few Gregories, and I remember he was big on negative theology, and I believe it was reflected in some of his prayers as well. Meanwhile, you have like Saint John Chrysostom, and I don't think he was so big on negative theology, nor was Basil the Great, because it doesn't seem to be reflected in their prayers.
Hmm.
So that is one of the interesting points, uh, I think, to mention about negative theology. I could be wrong.
Yeah. No, that's interesting you mentioned that. There's a I don't know if you know this author, Father John, I don't want to butcher his name, Romanides, Romanides. You know, the translation from Spanish is like is spelled, it sounds the way it's spelled, but English is
Mhm.
like, but he
Oh yeah.
he's a contemporary Orthodox theologian, and he
Mhm.
says that patristic theology is the well, I'll read, this is actually an abstract from his book. He actually wrote a book I found in English, but it says, in the West, a particular theology developed using human reason, whereas patristic theology centers on the revelation of God to the human heart through the illumined nous, which is, this is language taken from Anaxagoras, who talks about nous, who's a pre-Socratic philosopher. This book focuses on the difference between these two approaches to theology, as well as exploring the wider context of Greek philosophy. Then it talks about Russian theology and Neo-Hellenic theology. Because the
Mhm.
historical foundation of patristic theology lie in the united Christian empire of the Romans, whereas scholastic theology finds expression in Western Europe as shaped by the Franks. A final section on Franks and Romans presents controversial views of historical events, including the French and Greek Revolution. So, is it really a question of because I know when the whole the establishment of the Holy Roman Empire by the Frank Charlemagne, that was one of the turning points. So do you think that maybe deep down there could be a political issue involved where saying, wait a minute, this scholastic philosophy is just really much based on the Franks, whereas our Orthodox Greek philosophy is based on patristics, on the fathers.
I think almost everything, almost all the issues between East and West are political, because I remember very clearly one day uh, in a class, and I've not only the class, I've seen this so many times. Greek Orthodox priests are approached and asked, um, "Do you accept the doctrine of transubstantiation?" And they say, "No, we don't believe in any of that." And then they say, "So you don't believe that the bread and wine become the body of blood of Christ?" And they said, "Oh no, of course we believe that." And it's like, okay, so you don't like the term, and accept the you don't quite like the wording of the description of the term, but you it's like they believe the exact same thing, but they don't want to say, yeah, no, we don't like that label. It's like purgatory is another similar issue where the Orthodox have this thing called temporary hell. And well, what do you think that is? It's like they say that there are some souls that go to hell and they have to burn in hell for a little while because they didn't achieve theosis in life. And theosis is essentially their description of the process of achieving the beatific vision. So they say if you don't die in the beatific vision, by their terms, if you don't die having completed theosis, you have to go to hell and suffer for a little bit and basically get rid of all your earthly attachments in this temporary hell, and then you can go to heaven. And usually there's like this dramatic description of how like Jesus will descend and like bring you out to heaven, or the Blessed Virgin will descend and bring you out to heaven, which very much lines up with sort of the stories I've heard of purgatory, where you have like the Blessed Virgin descending every first Saturday to save souls and stuff. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that's really interesting you mentioned that because it does seem at least now the East and the West definitely need each other as two lungs. We mentioned this before, two lungs or two wings, faith and reason. Two lungs are John Paul II, right? In his was it Ex Corde Ecclesiae, or I don't know if I'm butchering the Latin, but basically his encyclical on the um kind of his outreach to the Orthodox, or talking about Eastern Catholicism, talks about that they essentially need each other. The Greeks definitely in the East definitely they have that depth, they have that, that profound doctrine. But I think what in the Latin Church they provide is that clarity. Scholasticism, one of the main characteristics is the precision of concepts through distinction. So I can understand one seeing it as rationalistic, and there is that danger. There is a decadence of scholasticism where it becomes it becomes so abstract that it makes no sense. The famous example of, students in the university talking about how many angels can fit on the pin of the head of a needle. It does devolve into it could possibly devolve into abstract questions that really make no sense, or that lose its focus in theology. So there's this good element of precision, yes, but there's I can understand it as one seeing it as too rationalistic, too intellectualist, because again, the mysteries of Christ, there's a fear reducing them to our level, to the point where they're just not mysteries anymore, and that's not what scholasticism wants to do. So we believe first, right? We believe and we know that we cannot exhaustively know the mysteries, right? And not because they're dark, they're the mysteries are dark. It's because they're too much light. It's like trying to look at the sun.
Mm-hmm.
So, but at the same time, we do want to understand by using profound philosophical categories, and that could come from anywhere. Using what Saint Justin called Father of the Church, or one of the first fathers, natural revelation, by using this to expound the mysteries and glimpse at them and understand them in our way. So I think they have this fear of just like kind of reductionism, basically.
Yeah, it is a justified fear,
Right.
because I think the thing that I've noticed is that if you take sort of scholasticism to its extreme is rationalism, and really that's just Protestantism. I think that's the main error, and a lot of times I've seen
So they
more
hated
success.
scholastics. I'm sorry, like
Yeah,
Luther
yeah.
hated St. Thomas, but yeah.
But it's ironic because they very much depend on sort of that movement, and then they just kind of like change something. So like Martin Luther's definition of like the real presence is very strange, and but
Consubstantiation. Yeah,
it's based sort of upon Thomas Aquinas's definition.
exactly.
And in my experience, a lot of times the ones who seem to have the best luck converting Protestants tend to be Eastern Christians.
Mm.
So there's a movement in America where it's like entire Protestant congregations are just becoming Orthodox or Greek Catholic, and
That's
it's almost like there's a balance sort of being restored. But of course, that balance isn't really balance unless there's union between the bishops. So there's not much of a victory in the long run if a bunch of Protestants convert to either Catholicism or Orthodoxy, and they end up holding on to some of their baggage and just kind of being very aggressive towards everyone.
no, no, yeah, Charles. Yeah, it's funny because the people, some Catholic friends have told me the most aggressive people, because in Jerusalem they have the Franciscans are actually in charge, and they're Western, even though the Eastern, they have. I don't think they're Eastern Franciscans, but at least they have. Correct me if I'm wrong, but at least they have kind of sympathy towards them, like as you told me
Mhm.
towards the Saint Francis. But he told me that the Orthodox, those are they're brutal in Jerusalem, like because in like in the Holy Sepulchre you have an Orthodox space for Mass, and then you have the Catholic space for Mass. But the Orthodox, they don't, like if you just like accidentally walk into their space, like they'll hit you with a stick Priest, like
Yeah,
it's
yeah, I
only
heard
holding
about
on to a stick, and then they hit people with it.
that. I heard once about there was an issue with sharing the space, and they had to actually share the exact same space for something. And they said that the Catholics ran overtime, so the Orthodox, and I believe they were mainly Greek, the Greek Orthodox, because it's the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Jerusalem. They sent in a deacon who they said was built like a bouncer, and he kicked the Catholics out. Meanwhile,
That's
you also have a strange thing going on among some of uh, the Middle Eastern Eastern Rite Christians, where you'll have Greek Catholics and Greek Orthodox giving each other communion, baptizing each other's children, and just attending each other's services like there's no problem. But it's like sometimes the moment it seems like the moment a political the sort of politics rears its head,
yeah,
because there was a group of Middle Eastern Christians. I think it was the Antiochian Church and the Melkite Church, and historically they were the same church, and then they split over the issue of accepting Rome, uh, or accepting the authority of Rome, and they issued a joint statement. Now, this I believe was between their patriarchs, the Melkite Patriarch and the Antiochian Patriarch. Uh, they issued a joint statement saying that they were in union with each other, um, and they would just sort of, wait for the other one to either come into union with Rome and the other to come into union with Constantinople, and they hoped it would bring about like further unity between Rome and Constantinople. That didn't work because both Rome and Constantinople, they came down and they like put the ban hammer on it, and they said, no, we do not accept your statement. This is like heretical. Like there was all this
very characteristic.
like fight going on with it.
That's
But the
hilarious.
Melkites,
Yeah,
I believe the Melkites and the Antiochian Orthodox still maintain that document, which is interesting.
that's hilarious. That's totally characteristic. Wow, that's very interesting. Um, to a point you said before about Martin Luther, you said an interesting point, very illuminative. I think that the Protestants are very much rationalistic. Oh, no, is that what you were saying? No, I think
Mhm.
you were saying that because the Protestants kind of they reacted to scholasticism, and actually Luther also hated Aristotle. He called Aristotle the devil's whore. He called philosophy witchcraft, actually. So
Yeah,
philosophy is witchcraft. So he had this really strong fideist bent, or fideism. So I think that's why they're kind of because the Orthodox, though they're very rooted in tradition, so they're saved from an extreme Protestant form of fideism. I think Luther extremely, with this extreme rejection of the rational aspect of theology and Roman Catholicism, he uh, he rebelled, and that's why the Protestants kind of see this attraction with Orthodox. You know, it's really interesting with postmodernism, and not this is not going off topic, but postmodernism is I have this book saying that it's very much compatible with Christianity, but the author is Protestant, because postmodernism is essentially irrationalist. So
yeah.
it's a movement against the rationalism which they said culminates in the two world wars. So they're very much irrationalist, and 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 there's an alliance seen between Protestants, postmodernists, and I don't even know, maybe the Orthodox in a sense could fall in line. I'm not sure, but the main thing is that the philosophy, without falling into intellectualism and rationalism, right? Because you don't want to reduce the mysteries to that, but without the reason, faith can easily devolve into superstition, and
Mhm.
that is a huge characteristic of the East. In
Mhm.
the East, and I'm not saying the church in the East, but just the people in the East in general, they tend to be very superstitious. I mean, I'm married, my wife is from the East, and they have these things that really have no basis in rationality. There's no foundation for their beliefs, and it's just made up. So
Yeah,
it's, that extreme I think is more, but it's interesting because the two extremes meet each other. And extreme rationalism, I think, can easily find an extreme fideism attractive, as opposed to I think it's harder. The truth is in the synthesis, as the saying goes, and it's harder to kind of find this a synthetic position where the truth resides. That
yeah.
makes
Well, one of the things I've noticed too is that there is an alliance between certain aspects of Protestantism with modern Orthodoxy, where if you go, one of the reasons why I tend to, when I think about Orthodoxy, or when I reference Orthodoxy, I tend to try to stick with the older more traditional Orthodox, because you do have like there was a priest I knew who, it was a joke that will probably offend some people, but he told me, he said, never go by the Greek Orthodox, because he said they're the Novus Ordo of the Orthodox.
Oh wow.
So he told me, he said, to stick with he told me, he said, if you want real Orthodoxy, stick with the Slavs and with the Middle Eastern. And also with, there's this strange sort of sect of, Greek Orthodoxy based entirely around a monastery, Mount Athos. I think they call it Athonite Greek Orthodoxy. And they rejected a whole bunch of the reforms of modern Greek reforms. So if you go to their stuff, weirdly enough, it's more similar to what you would see at a Slavic church, because the Slavs didn't accept a lot of reforms. But even within, like, say, Russian Orthodoxy, which most people tend to view as being very traditional, you
Mhm.
have a huge fight between the uh, post-Niconian and pre-Niconian uses. With the post-Niconian uses, usually they condemn the pre-Niconian uses as being like, they say, oh well, they're very almost pagan, like they're very into what is it, like they're very ritualistic, and they're
Like
very afraid,
formalist.
like, yeah, almost like that, yeah.
Yeah.
And then you have the pre-Niconian group condemning the post-Niconian group, saying, well, they don't worship like, what is it? It's almost like the Latin Mass argument, where
Mm.
they say that, they worship the way that their faith is, and that, so like the example of the two-fingered sign of the cross, they say Christ was crucified, not the Trinity, and that the Trinity's, part of the sign of the cross, but Christ is crucified, and they make that a practical point. And so you have a lot of this sort of, like, it's almost like all different versions of the fight between extreme mysticism and extreme rationalism, just in different forms in different ethnic groups.
That's
It often does seem to be the foundation of, like, schisms, and they can be pretty major.
that's really fascinating to say that, because I definitely think ethnic certain ethnicities tend to be tend to have a certain uh, proclivity in that sense. Like, well, the Germans are the West, but the Germans tend to be rationalistic as opposed to maybe the Middle Easterns
Mhm.
um, tend to be less of, more passionate, or maybe more just kind of believing fides. But that's interesting because you're talking the notion of development, which you're alluding to. That is that's an interesting topic because it seems like it's kind of decentralized in Orthodoxy, and because it's decentralized, and I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the even Eastern Catholics share more in Orthodoxy than Western Catholics in many things, many things, and maybe in this, in this theology, but it seems like there is obviously, well, you got, I mean, Catholics, Eastern Catholics believe in right, they recognize papal infallibility, right, which is dogmatically defined in Vatican Vatican One. So and the guidance of the magisterium. So really, the question is in the East. I don't know if this is just Orthodox. It seems so because again, Catholics. But in the East is how I guess they just deny theological development. because they accept what the first seven councils of the church, and really after that, no theological development is allowed, from what I understand, because there is no kind of there's no magisterium. There's only a magisterium of the patriarch. Is that right? And is he the one who kind of he decides what is orthodox with the lowercase o, what is acceptable into the canon of doctrine, we can say, and what's not, or how does that work? Like develop?
The,
I don't know.
the thing I could say about it is that it is incredibly complicated because there is no unity. They don't have, and there is an issue. It is kind of ironic, I think, that there are seven universally accepted councils, and those are the ones where everyone was united with each other. As
Right.
you have, I think there were Orthodox attempts at having other councils, and they ended up just not sticking. And even with like the Roman Church, like the Orthodox will they'll agree that they believe, like you have to explain something and they'll agree to it. But if you use the term, they say no, we don't believe that. That's Latin. Like again, purgatory. I talked to a Coptic Orthodox friend, and they were taught the wrong thing with purgatory. So sometimes when you talk to the Orthodox, you cannot use the terminology because I
Mm,
spoke with one and it was actually misexplained to them by a Catholic deacon because they went to a Catholic school growing up. They told them that purgatory was a second chance, that you could either go to heaven or hell from purgatory, which is not true.
let's see.
And I had to break down the entire concept and explain to them what purgatory is. And they said, oh, that's completely acceptable to Orthodoxy,
Mm.
but not the term. Not the term.
It's
Just
more
the
of a question of terminology than content, basically.
yeah,
Which is
yeah.
ridiculous. Basis of all
And
fights. That's really interesting. I'm sorry. Well,
yeah. And it's interesting too with this this issue of like you see a lot of infighting between even the Greeks, even among the Greeks, who like that priest jokingly told me are the Novus Ordo of the Orthodox, was even within the Greeks you have huge, tremendous fighting, where there was an old metropolitan who during COVID came out during the COVID lockdowns came out and condemned the current patriarch, and he said that your lockdowns are your support of the lockdowns are anti-orthodox, and he went into all the reasons why. He said the Eucharist cannot be a source of sickness. The Eucharist is only a source of healing. You can't go to church, and he actually condemned them so hard that he said that going to church wearing a mask is a mortal sin. In their terminology, they don't use mortal sin because he said it's if you went to heaven you wouldn't wear a mask because there's no illness in heaven. So he said there's no illness in the church, which is it's
I like
technically
that
true,
actually. That's kind of cool.
and it's technically true. I mean, it's technically true.
Yeah.
But then the patriarch came out and condemned him and said, "No, he's old. Don't listen to him."
Wow. Yeah, that's
So
interesting. Yeah.
you have like all this like there's a lot of infighting there, and a lot of it does stem from, and I believe there was a Russian philosopher who came up with this philosophical argument, saying that there's a that there should be a universal head to something. Like he said that one of the most effective governments in the world was the Roman Empire because they had a head.
Right.
And he said that the church also has a head. And he said that, of course, the head of the church is Christ, but he said that the head of the church on earth was Peter, and the successor to Peter is the Pope of Rome.
Right.
So he
Right.
said, therefore, to be truly Orthodox, you need to be in union with this head on earth.
Right.
And it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that there can't be someone who's claiming to be the head, like a heretic. Technically, a heretic can't be a pope. So it doesn't mean that there's someone. Doesn't mean that you have to listen to someone just because they call themselves the pope. If they're doing something wrong, you don't have to listen to them. But you have to accept the authority when they're acting with authority. Otherwise, you're just going to end up in complete anarchy.
Yeah, that's a really good point you just say, because it reminds me also that the Holy Spirit definitely, you know, suscitates, we can say, or resurrects religious orders based on the needs of the time. So as Luther, there's a lot of interesting parallels between Luther and the Protestant rebellion, which caused a lot of chaos. And the Jesuit order, so the Jesuit order is really an order of governance and
Hmm.
to establish. I mean, they had a fourth vow of obedience to the Pope, which was pretty radical, right? They were called the Pope's men, and their superior was called the Black Pope, actually. So they were really much in line and tremendous, uh, kind of the counter of Protestantism. So that's interesting. And I know the Orthodox had huge problems with the Jesuits because the Jesuits were very strongly Roman, very strongly Latin. The Jesuits and the Jesuits also were present in, I would say, the greatest council of the church, the Council of Trent. The greatest council because it just, I mean, with Protestantism coming up, it just defines so many things. So, what is the East view on the Council of Trent, the Jesuits? You know, if you want to.
Hmm. Well, I could say, of course, the Orthodox don't accept Trent, but there is a very interesting history with the Jesuits because they were essentially, at one point, the Pope was just going to get rid of them. So they hid in Russia.
That's right. Yeah,
They were taken care of by the Russian
Catherine.
Orthodox.
Catherine. Yeah.
And you have, it was like they had this strange, like very strange relationship, and it's a relationship I've seen time and time again in the East, where you'll have the Orthodox, they they don't like the Jesuits, for example. Like the Russian Orthodox did not like the Jesuits, but they wanted them to teach their kids.
Hmm.
Uh, and then you have another similar thing that happened like that with the old ritualists and the Ukrainians. When the condemnation of pre-Niconian usage happened, a lot of them moved westward and they moved into Ukraine and the Carpathians and Poland, and they settled in areas with Greek Catholics, and they would have incredibly intense debates because the Greek Catholics do use, they have different recensions, and I don't believe they knew that at the time. So you'd have the pre-Niconians telling the Greek Catholics, "You're doing things wrong, you Hellenized." And you have the Ukrainians saying, "No, you guys are messed up because we're using the older recension." But then they would just end there. There was no physical, they weren't attacking each other, they wouldn't kill each other. And to both groups, that was like huge because both of them were used to being killed by, say, the Tsar. The Tsar
Right.
would
Right.
have people come down on them and kill them, like they were killing Russians for making the two-fingered sign of the cross. And for the first time in a while, the old ritualists were actually able to build churches. They got to a point where they would lay out their icons and everything, and not even hang them on the wall, because they wanted to be able to grab them and run when the police came. When they moved westward, they could actually build churches. So you had this strange alliance of, we don't like you, we'll fight, but it's almost like they enjoy fighting, so they just keep that up and they keep them around so they could fight with them. Just like with the Jesuits and the Russians, it was like they wanted them to teach their kids, but they didn't want to accept Latinism, which ironically the Russians did accept some Latinisms, like wearing black vestments for the dead.
Right. 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 No, that's fascinating. Now the problem with the so language. I mean, I don't know why you would reject terminology. Why you agree with content, and that's what I see a little bit with this rigidity with the East,
Mhm.
as opposed to the West is more eclectic. It's allowing of different terminologies, and again, the Latinization sometimes does come down hard. So in different aspects, there could be an imposition, but basically doctrinally, if you have a better term, you should be open to that wherever it comes from.
Mhm.
Um, but I think the main theologian, and from the early fathers, and this could be even the West could agree with this. I say is Origin. I mean, Origin is tremendous. He used philosophy, and I have something here because this is a really excellent work by, well, encyclical, I should say, by on the restoration of Christian philosophy. You can't see it there; it's kind of blurry. By Pope Leo XIII, who wrote the Aeterni Patris, who wrote this in the 19th century because precisely in theology was becoming very rationalistic, and then you have the Fides group. So you have this huge kind of battle in the 19th century here. And he wrote this encyclical, which gave a resurgence to Thomism called Neo-Thomism, which exists now. So it has really strong. I don't know if you ever heard of Garrigou Lagrange, and these are really like kind of we could say they were the the antitheses of modernist theologians. Modernism being a plague. There's also heresy, which interestingly in Orthodoxy, I don't even think affects modernism being, as Saint Pius X calls the summable heresies, because it provides a philosophical or anti-philosophical framework that makes theology impossible, actually. So it's really problematic. But so here in the encyclical, Gregory of this is another Gregory, Neo Caesarea. This is not Gregory of the famous one known as Nazianzen or Gregory of Nyssa. This is another one, Neo Caesarea. He praises Origen expressly because, with singular dexterity, as one snatches weapons from the enemy, he turned to the defense of Christian wisdom and to the destruction of superstition many arguments drawn from the writings of the pagans. Right? So Origen was very philosophical, and I don't understand essentially how kind of philosophy can be seen in negative view to apply it to the mysteries of faith. It's kind of for me, it's mind-boggling. Again, I can understand that the fear of one extreme exists, but at the same time, your own, I mean, your own fathers did this. Origin being a main one.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, and it is interesting because traditionally Origen wasn't he he wasn't really quoted in the East after he was condemned. They kind of I think I remember hearing stuff about his writings being burned, and his followers had to go hide in caves.
Yeah, it's
And
crazy.
ironically, of all people, I believe one of the ones who was actually being nice to Origen's followers was Saint John Chrysostom, who is sort of like the anti-Origen in a lot of ways, because the main issue with Origen wasn't necessarily his philosophy or his use of terminology. It was he was very allegorical, and when you came to John Chrysostom, he was very literal when it came to his interpretation of the scriptures. And that's not exclusive because John Chrysostom would speak about allegory, and
Right.
Origen would come out and say, no, this is not just an allegory for something. Like I believe Origen said that the resurrection of Christ was real. It wasn't just an allegory. I believe he said that it was a physical resurrection.
Yeah.
But you do have that issue with Origen, and I noticed Origen seems to be making much more of a comeback in modern times. And I think it was sort of the influence of the Greeks, and I could be wrong because I don't know all the history on it, but to me it seems like it was the influence of the Greeks through the ecumenical movement on Rome, because now they teach Origen all over the place in Rome. I believe he was cited a lot in the Second Vatican Council.
Yeah,
Um,
that's true. And Benedict the 16th actually, he mentions Origin a lot, and is one
mhm,
of the theologians that really shaped him. Now, the allegorical sense is not. Some people see it as kind of a denial of the literal sense, but really more historical sense. But no, both of them are compatible. In the West, you have that too. Like you have Saint Augustine tends to be very. I mean, I've read his commentary on Genesis, and it's really, I mean, he takes Adam, and he
mhm,
talks about each letter of the word Adam in Latin would be north, south, east, and west. He does an entire theology of Adam and saying
mhm,
that he symbolizes, because that's essentially what allegory is, the entire mankind by his very name, and just
mhm,
going on this just theologizing. So it's interesting though that the East would kind of find a problem with that. That yes, you do have the Antiochian school, which was more kind of down to earth. I believe John Chrysostom was from the Antiochian school, and then you have the Alexandrian school, which is hardcore, right, in allegory. But
Hmm.
the question is, I guess, are they incompatible? No, I mean, I don't know if the Orthodox see that as such, or but definitely Origen, he believed in the pre-existing soul. So that is, the problem is, as we said, which could justify their claim in a sense that you want to conform philosophy to the faith. You don't want to conform the faith to philosophy, right? And that's the
Yeah, yeah.
big
And
massive.
the other thing too with Thomas Aquinas is, I believe I was reading something about Thomas Aquinas, and they said that a lot of his writings actually didn't quote the Latin fathers because he didn't have them available. A lot of times he actually quoted the Greek fathers,
Right? That's right.
and I believe it was the Patriarch Joseph. I've heard different ways to pronounce his last name. Some people say Joseph Slippy, some people say Joseph Schleppe. The Patriarch of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. He, I believe, his life goal was essentially to show that Thomas Aquinas's writings were compatible with Eastern Orthodoxy,
Wow.
and he was Greek Catholic. So of course, being Greek Catholic, there's the old-fashioned view of us being the bridge between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, even though I believe it was Pius, one of the Pope Piuses actually said, no, we're fully Orthodox and fully Catholic, so we're not just a bridge. But Joseph Schleppe saw this as a one of his jobs to sort of show that they're compatible. And I believe he actually did make his point so well that there were some Orthodox theologians that read Joseph's writings and said, yeah, he's got something here.
To be honest, I mean, the apopathic theology, which with in which orthodoxy they kind of focus on, it was also called negative theology, which means that it's a theology by negation. Okay, yes, you negate essentially what the creatures have, and then you're able to. So it does have a positive content. Thomas Aquinas was very much into apopathic.
Mhm.
I'm probably not saying it right in English. Uh, apophatic. I'm sorry, apophatic theology. Thomas Aquinas also talks about that really, you know, naturally speaking, we because we since we know immediately creatures, the objects of sense, what we could affirm of God is what we deny in creatures. So, what are some attributes of God? Immortal, that's a negation. Infinite, that's a negation, right? Perfect. Essentially, that's a negation of imperfection. So, really, these notions we don't know them directly, but we know them only indirectly through creation. So, there is a lot of you could you could say inroads to scholastic theology where the Orthodox can easily say, "Oh, this is the case." Now, I can understand them seeing Thomas Aquinas assuming a lot of Aristotle's terminology and not liking that. Right, I can
Mhm.
understand that. Aristotle, was very slowly accepted in the church. Thomas Aquinas was considered a liberal in his time. You know, the
Mhm.
conservative, the conservative position was the Bonaventurian, Augustinian position, which was very much Platonic in the 13th century, especially. So that was a conservative position, and Thomas Aquinas was seen as this liberal. But his teacher, which was another great doctor of the church, Saint Albert the Great, kind of motivate him and helped him. But really, so Aristotle, without understanding that terminology, one could just read Thomas Aquinas and be like, "What in the world?" Right? Matter and form, act and potency, right? Substance and accident, existence and essence. You're reading these metaphysical terms, but it comes from the Greek, right?
Mhm.
Well, and that's another question too, because Aristotle was we knew him through the Arab translation, right? Because of the Muslim empire. Essentially, they had they pretty much took the works and they burned the Library of Alexandria, which is I remember having a teacher saying, "Oh, he was so upset." Like he was like visibly upset about it, which it is upsetting. But little by little, as Islam, kind of consolidated, they did have a philosophy of their own, Avicenna, Averroes. So um, again, I could see not knowing, it's a superficial judgment. You see these terms and you automatically say incompatible with our theology. It's like get to know what he's saying, get to know what
Mhm.
these terms mean, right? And this is the whole notion of development. I would say scholasticism is the apogee, right? The epitome of philosophy of theology, where it really, got up to its highest peak in development. And that's why Leo the 13th wrote this encyclical saying the beacon of light is Thomas Aquinas. Not that there can be anything further developments besides Thomas Aquinas, of course, but him at least in principle as foundation. You have to think twice before going against Thomas Aquinas. He really we need to kind of resurrect his mentality in order to and why have this position, why have this philosophy, avoid error, right, to affirm truth.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. And I do think it's interesting that you always see sort of historical parallels popping up. So, and one of the big things I've noticed in the West, not so much in the East, because they don't really have the distinction of conservative and liberal. But one of
Mm,
the things I find very interesting in the West is that you'll have a liberal, all of a sudden there's a paradigm shift and now they're conservative.
yeah, Jesuit,
So
same thing. Yeah,
so you had the Jesuits, you had Thomas Aquinas, you had how many of the more modern theologians like Ratzinger and who was the other one? I can't remember his name, a French guy. I had to do a whole bunch of work in college on this French guy.
Maritain, right? Is it Dominican? Oh, Maritain.
No, no, I think he was a Jesuit. Uh,
Oh, don't
I
tell me
can't,
it's the cosmic Christ guy.
probably not. I
Okay.
don't think I remember reading about that. But you had all these very liberal, uh, you had all these liberal theologians that they were liberal going into the Second Vatican Council. They come out of the Second Vatican Council, now they're conservative.
Yeah, the
So
communio, the
yeah,
resourcement theologians. Yeah, yeah,
and even you look at it politically, and this did affect the East, but you look at it politically. Before the French Revolution, the English were considered liberal. After the French Revolution and all this like killing and all this craziness, suddenly the English are conservative.
yeah, yeah.
And you have look at Prussia. Prussia was conservative until after World War One, and then suddenly it becomes liberal through the use of through Adolf Hitler. It becomes very liberal. Russia, they were conservative until the Red Revolution. Now they're liberal. They're ultra liberal. They're so liberal that they're communist.
Right,
So
right, right. Yeah,
and
that's there has to be certain criteria there. That's really interesting. That you would have certain considered quote unquote liberals that would become conservatives afterwards. Yeah, that is really interesting. But I hope that doesn't happen today with the liberals we consider. I doubt that would happen today because no, I don't like those uh uh, kind of those labels because the church definitely transcends that. I mean, it's hard to not apply those to the church. And I did like when Pope Francis says, "No, we have to be above beyond that." But Pope Francis is, I like leftist. I don't know, leftist. Um, Again, because essentially communist, but modernist. I like applying it to the church. But I
mm,
think, I mean, Pope Francis, I think I mean, his view will never be conservative. I don't know if his view becomes conservative. Oh, that would be very problematic. But I'm sorry, I think I cut you off. I'm going to cut
I
you off.
I think the thing with this liberals becoming conservative doesn't necessarily have to do with I think it's kind of an illusion, because if you compare Thomas Aquinas, and I think it's like you look at the writings of Patriarch Joseph, uh, and I think what his writings proved was that Thomas Aquinas was actually not liberal, was that he was actually, you look at him and everything he said did line up with the church fathers. It was just sort of like a different way of explaining the church fathers
Right.
and mixing it with something else. And almost like the way I would defend Thomas Aquinas would be that, and even a lot of the other Western church doctors that took, pagan philosophy, they took the pagan philosophy and then they purified it and they made it acceptable, because there's, just because somebody, uses, pagan terminology doesn't necessarily mean, or terminology that originated under the pagans doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong or bad. You look at the practice of Easter eggs. Easter eggs, that was something coming from, specifically, I know more of the Eastern end. The Easter eggs was something, especially among Ukrainians, they call them Sanki, I think, or Sanka. That was a pagan practice. They would take the eggs and they would make them all decorative, and
Right.
it had to do with life's triumph over death. So when the Christians came, they said, "Oh, that's perfect. We'll take it." And
Yeah.
they even relate it to the myth of, or not even really the myth, the story of uh, Mary. I think it was Mary Magdalene with the egg. She had some sort of dinner with a Roman governor, and she was eating a hard-boiled egg, and it was, of course, white. And the emperor says, she says, "Christ is risen," to the emperor, and he says, "If Christ is risen, that egg will turn red," and it turned red. So,
Oh wow. That's where we get these traditions from, huh? My God. That's fascinating. Yeah, that's the notion of halos too. Halos
mhm.
were before, right? Halos were from pagans. So yeah, I mean, that requires. I think the Jesuits were masters at that. They were able to, and they may have even actually um, liberal, the label liberal also applying to them in a sense that I mean, there's this father Janos, and he went to convert the communists, kind of like being because what the Jesuits did, they immersed themselves into a culture, like Saint John, John Brebeuf and Isaac Jogues. They would live with the Indians, and they would see all these crazy things, atrocities, and perversions, but they would live with them in order to bring them out. You have to have superhuman virtue for that, right? Ultimately, grace, obviously, and just a lot of human wisdom too. But this Father Yano said that he went to convert the communists, but he said, "I went to convert the communists, but I didn't convert the communists. They converted me. So
Oh
he
wow,
became a communist," and he says that openly. So
yeah,
that's the problem with that. That there is that danger of, wait a minute, let me go into this culture and purify their elements. But then you can be so fascinated with that culture that you instead, and again, it goes back to heresy. You essentially mold your beliefs and yourself to that culture and become part of it. That's was a huge controversy with the Jesuits and the Dominicans. They were allowing the Chinese in China. They were allowing the Chinese to kind of, well, they worship their ancestors. So the Jesuits were kind of allowing them, but giving it a different bent, if you will, saying, "No, well, the community of saints, things like that." And the Jesuits and the Dominicans, who were really hardcore conservatives, Dominicans, interestingly, um, but they were very conservative against the Jesuits. They complained to the Pope, and then the Pope recalled, took the Jesuits out of there. Some people say it was based on jealousy and things like that, but yeah, that's really interesting history there. But anyway, I don't know if you could say some, if you want to say something else, and then we can start wrapping it up.
I guess I could mention the Jesuits again because
Yeah.
it's interesting. There's this group uh, of Jesuits that are all Eastern Rite, that are called the Russian Jesuits, even though they're not necessarily all Russian. But
Wow.
there's this group of Jesuits that are known as the Russian Jesuits. A lot of them are Russian
Interesting.
Greek Catholic, and one of them was a very good writer, Father Robert Taft. He was a friend of my friend, and then there's another one. Father Serge Kelleher, who I believe was Irish. He was ethnically Irish, born in Manhattan, and moved back to Ireland, and he founded I think it was a Ukrainian Greek Catholic church. And I don't remember. There's a debate about whether he was Russian Catholic or Ukrainian Catholic, because some of the stuff when you involve the Jesuits gets weird with where they draw their jurisdiction from. But they were Jesuits, but they were incarnated in an Eastern Rite, and their goal was to convert the Orthodox. So a lot of them were Russian, and
Hmm.
it didn't really catch on in the West. So a lot of the Russian Jesuits that were here died, or they're old now, and they can't really go to Russia and evangelize the way they wanted to. But there is a movement of Russia of Jesuits from the Eastern countries, and they are totally different than the modern Western Jesuits. It was almost like they were there, they were behind the Iron Curtain. When the Iron Curtain came down, they came out to meet the other Jesuits, and they were like, it was almost like seeing two different it's like seeing two different types of bear. It's like one became the polar bear, the other became the grizzly bear, and it's like they don't look anything alike, they don't act anything alike. And we had a very solid bishop who was a Jesuit, and I think in Parma, for the Ruthenian Byzantine Catholic Church. And he was a Jesuit. He used a lot of Jesuit terminology, and I believe he had the eparchy participate in the Synod on Synodality. But he used the Synod and Synodality, which the Eastern churches do not have to listen to, because it applies only to the West. It doesn't apply to the East.
Mm.
Uh,
Mhm.
he implemented the Synod and Synodality and used it to bring back things that were being suppressed, Eastern uses that were being suppressed. So you have this uh, the Jesuits are very interesting. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's fascinating. All right, well, it's been a good discussion. I mean, we can conclude that theology is a profound endeavor. Um, Definitely requires incorporating different elements. It develops. Not that reality itself develops, obviously. That's what modernists believe, but
Mhm.
rather our understanding of reality has to develop. I mean, the apostles did have an infusion of knowledge that they could not put into words right away. I mean, Jesus himself told them, I have much to reveal to you, but you cannot take it in all now. So, but the apostles never used terms like, hypostasis or, homoousion, or, which is of one substance, or transubstantiation. So, these terms are necessary for us to understand, according to our nature, the mysteries of faith. So we do want to affirm though also the Orthodox, and kind of understand their fear, but we do want to affirm that the mysteries are obviously ineffable. We cannot understand them, not even close to exhaustively, because that would be rationalism. Saint Augustine said, if you understand God, he's not God. That's not God.
Mhm.
He's not God. So um, basically, it's you can have both. Try philosophy is good. Philosophy is natural revelation. Saint Justin said is a um, is a legit source of knowledge, though infinitely limited compared to the knowledge of faith. So I think there's a conflation here that even the goal is mysticism, a mystical experience. But if your mystical experience is ineffable, then it is you can't express it, you can't communicate it, and then we just become, we're just enclosed in our own experience. And then theology not as a science cannot, how can you spread your faith, right? So I
Mhm.
think we should, following St. Peter. He says, defending philosophy, give a reason for what you believe, right? Reason. um I, I believe translation is logos or logoi, um, meaning, reason, ordered argumentation, rationale, right? So again, the emergence of reason and faith gives us the birth of theology. And I don't want to give you the last word if you want to say something.
I think it is interesting too, like you mentioned, with if when your experience becomes so mystical that you can't explain it,
Mm.
because that very thing I think is sort of a part of the process of theosis, or receiving the beatific vision, because when Thomas Aquinas, I believe it was on St. Nicholas Day, towards the end of his life, he had this mystical vision of God, and he started telling people, "Burn all my work; it's straw." So and that's definitely true. If he had started out that way, Thomas, like, we wouldn't. How much stuff would we be missing out on now
That's right. That's
if
right.
he had not been able to write that way for us?
Yeah, no, that's right. That's right. So they both can be compatible. The thing is, we don't, kind of, and Saint Augustine says reason can smooth the path to the faith. Ultimately, God gives us faith. We respond to it. Faith is a gift, but we respond to it. But reason, which comes from God, can smooth the path to faith as an instrument that God uses um, in order for us to obtain faith. A lot of people do not convert. Most people have a conversion that's like an extraordinary experience, but there are people who do convert through through the intellect. Again, it is the grace of God that moves us, but these are the instruments that God uses. Oh, this makes sense, right? The logos, and logos, really the ology, the end of each word means is a science, means that
Mhm.
there's a philosophy to it, biology, archaeology, the logos. And the logos is Christ, right? Christ is St. John took on that word with Heraclitus also used, or Heraclitus is in English, also used as a reasoned kind of intelligence behind all the change in the universe. So really this ordered knowledge allows us to not only know, um, but really to communicate that knowledge, and we need human terms for that. So yes, mystical experience would be the goal for sure, but we need kind of the incorporation of the natural realm in order for us to communicate it, because again, if it's ineffable, I cannot communicate it with you. It's kind of like when Jesus comes down, he does not tell us directly about the mysteries of God, but rather indirectly through parables in that sense. So theology is limited in the sense it has to use human categories, which are words. Words are signs of reality. So words are signs of things that we experience um, in order to communicate. Um, and even science is actually getting into this realm too. I mean, you get to the quantum mechanics, is getting to the metaphysical realm, and now you're having words that, I mean, you're having realities that you really can't, you can't reduce to a word where you can communicate it. So it's, gravity, really, people don't really, scientists know what gravity is, they know its effect and what it does, but there are some scientists who deny gravity. So if the natural realm is mysterious, how much more the supernatural realm? Yes. But at the same time, we need to, in a natural sense, without, obscuring the goal of mystical experience, and that's our goal. But we need to use the rational as, again, smoothing the path, as St. Augustine said. All right. Well, thank you very much, brother, for coming on. It's been good. God bless you. And until next time, all right. Take care now.